Disclaimer. March 26, 2018, 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The U.S. Treasury Department announces sanctions against the Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska and his companies, including Rusal, the world's second-largest aluminum producer outside of China. $7.6 billion in annual revenue. The goal? To cripple a pillar of the Russian economy. The result? Something entirely different. ***. Within 10 days, global aluminum prices spiked 35%. A supply shock rippled through manufacturing from Detroit to Dortmund. By April 23, the U.S. Treasury was forced into an embarrassing retreat, lifting sanctions on Rusal to avert a self-inflicted crisis. A pattern was exposed. A weapon had misfired. This is the story of the sanction spiral. This is the pattern of a financial weapon that, when overused, systematically destroys the very system it was designed to protect. History shows that economic sanctions, intended to punish and isolate, often catalyze the rise of rival systems. And the creation of a dollar-free financial network by over 40 nations is evidence that the spiral is now accelerating. ***. The framework is clear. It is a 5-stage collapse of financial hegemony. Stage 1. The weaponization. A dominant power turns its currency and payment systems into tools of geopolitical coercion. Stage 2. The shock and adaptation. The targeted nation suffers, but immediately begins searching for and finding alternatives. Stage 3. The coalition. Isolated nations band together, pooling resources to build parallel infrastructure. Stage 4. The institutionalization. Ad hoc workarounds harden into formal, new systems and institutions. Stage 5. The erosion and flip. The dominant power's financial tools lose potency, global transaction share declines, and the economic order flips. We have seen this pattern dismantle empires. Spain's trade embargoes in the 16th century. Britain's naval blockade power in the early 20th. And now, America's financial sanctions regime in the 21st. And the U.S. dollar system is at stage 4. Right now, ***. The story begins not with a sanction, but with a gift. July 1944. Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. 44 allied nations designed the post-war economic order. The U.S. dollar, backed by the world's largest gold reserves, is crowned the world's reserve currency. By 1971, the gold backing is severed, but the system holds. Why? Because of a deeper, more powerful foundation, the petrodollar. 1974, a secret deal is struck between the U.S. Treasury and Saudi Arabia. Saudi oil will be sold exclusively in U.S. dollars. In return, the kingdom receives U.S. military protection and investment in Treasury debt. Every nation needing oil needed dollars. Global demand for dollars became insatiable. The Federal Reserve's printing press gained global legitimacy. By the year 2000, the U.S. controlled the plumbing of global finance. SWIFT, Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, a Belgian-based cooperative, had become the indispensable messaging system for cross-border payments. While technically neutral, U.S. influence was supreme. The CHIPS system in New York cleared dollar settlements. American banks were the gateway. This was the ultimate exorbitant privilege. The U.S. could run massive deficits, borrow in its own currency, and export inflation. It could freeze assets, block transactions, and cut off entire nations from the dollar system with the stroke of a pen. The weapon seemed invincible. A financial nuclear option with no fallout for the wielder. By 2014, the U.S. dollar constituted 88% of all global foreign exchange transactions. The euro trailed at 32%. It was a monopoly. The fatal decision, the trigger. September 14, 2001. 9 a.m. President George W. Bush signs Executive Order 13224. It declares a national emergency against terrorist financing. A necessary, justified tool post, 9/11. The precedent, however, was set. The dollar system was now officially a weapon for national security. The turning point accelerated over the next decade. 2012, the U.S. enacts the COTSA sanctions, threatening secondary sanctions on any entity doing business with Iran. European companies, against their will, are forced to comply. The message is clear. U.S. law is global law. But the fatal, overreaching decision, the one that made dozens of nations realize this weapon could one day be aimed at them, came in 2014. March 2014. Russia annexes Crimea. The U.S. and EU respond with targeted sanctions on individuals and entities. Then, July 17, 2014. Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 is shot down over eastern Ukraine. The West points the finger at Russian-backed separatists. The response was a quantum leap in financial warfare. September 12, 2014. The U.S. Treasury sanctions major sectors of the Russian economy: energy, finance, and defense. It cuts off Sberbank, VTB, Gazprombank from U.S. debt markets. It blocks technology exports for deepwater and Arctic oil projects. The goal was to make the Russian economy scream. And it did. The ruble lost half its value. Inflation spiked to 17%. Capital fled. But in a boardroom in Moscow, and in finance ministries from Beijing to New Delhi, a silent calculation was made. A new question was asked. If they can do this to Russia, a nuclear power, and a G8 member, what stops them from doing it to us? The weaponization was complete. The adaptation was about to begin. Nobody in Washington saw what was coming next, because history had already written the script. A 5-stage spiral. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. The weaponization of economic dominance is an ancient playbook. Its overuse triggers a predictable, 5-stage counterreaction that dismantles the dominant system from the outside in. This is the sanction spiral. Let us trace its steps through 3 empires who failed to learn the lesson: Imperial Spain, the British Empire, and the Soviet bloc. Stage 1. The weaponization. The dominant power, confident in its unassailable position, turns its economic advantages into explicit tools of coercion. Historical example 1. Imperial Spain, 1560 to 1600. 1556. Philip II inherits a global empire financed by New World silver. The Spanish Real de Ocho becomes the world's first truly global currency. 1567. To crush the Protestant Dutch revolt, Philip II weaponizes trade. He seizes Dutch ships in Iberian ports and embargoes all commerce with the rebellious provinces. The goal: strangle the Dutch economy by cutting them off from the lifeblood of Spanish silver and the lucrative Iberian market. The assumption: the Dutch, with no natural resources, would capitulate. Spanish dominance was absolute. Historical example 2. The British Empire, 1914 to 1919. 1914. The British pound sterling is the world's reserve currency, backed by the gold standard and the Royal Navy's command of the seas. August 1914. At the outbreak of World War I, Britain declares a long-distance blockade of Imperial Germany. Using its naval supremacy, it intercepts neutral ships, blacklists foreign companies trading with Germany, and seizes contraband goods. The goal: starve the German war machine and population into surrender by controlling global maritime trade. The assumption: neutral nations, especially the United States, would acquiesce to British law on the high seas. The financial system centered on London was irreplaceable. Historical example 3. The United States, 2001 to 2014. 2001 to 2014. As detailed, the U.S. evolves its sanctions from targeted, Cuba, 1960, to comprehensive, Iran, 2012, to strategic sectoral, Russia, 2014. The toolbox expands: secondary sanctions, punishing third parties, asset freezes, and exclusion from SWIFT as threatened against Iran, become standard. The assumption: the dollar's 88% FX share, the ubiquity of SWIFT, and the depth of U.S. capital markets created a captive system with no alternative. Stage 2. The shock and adaptation. The targeted entity suffers an acute crisis, which immediately triggers innovative, desperate workarounds. The first cracks in the monopoly appear. Historical example 1. The Dutch Republic, 1568 to 1609. The The shock. The Spanish embargo cripples Antwerp and traditional Dutch trade routes. Initial economic desperation. The adaptation. Dutch merchants build a new global trading network from scratch. They sail directly to the Baltic, bypassing Iberian middlemen. They establish the Amsterdam Exchange Bank, 1609, and the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, creating a more efficient, trustworthy financial system than Spain's. The irony. By 1600, Amsterdam replaces Antwerp as Europe's financial center. Spanish silver now often flowed through Dutch ports. Historical example 2, Germany and neutrals, 1914 to 1918. The shock. The British blockade causes severe food and material shortages in Germany, contributing to over 700,000 civilian deaths from starvation and disease. The adaptation. Germany accelerates chemical synthesis, creating fertilizers and explosives from air. Neutral nations like Sweden and the Netherlands establish complex barter and clearing systems to trade with Germany outside British-controlled sterling and shipping lanes. The irony. The blockade's brutality, especially against civilians, fueled lasting anti-British resentment and proved the system could be gamed. Historical example 3, Russia and Iran, 2014 to 2017. The shock. 2014 to 2016. Russian ruble collapses 50%, inflation hits 17%, GDP contracts by 3.7%. The adaptation. Immediate de-dollarization begins. Russia and Iran sign oil-for-goods barter deals. They build their own domestic financial messaging systems, SBFS in Russia, CPAM in Iran. They increase gold reserves and purge U.S. treasuries from their central banks. The critical pivot. 2015. Russia and China connect their SWIFT alternative payment systems. The first institutional thread of a new web is spun. Stage 3. The coalition. Isolated targets find each other. Bilateral workarounds multiply into multilateral agreements. A coalition of the sanctioned, and those fearing they could be next, begins to form. This is no longer adaptation. This is alliance building. Historical example 1. The anti-Habsburg coalition, early 1600s. Spain's enemies coalesce. Dutch merchants, shut out of Iberia, partner with English privateers and French traders to raid Spanish treasure fleets and develop alternative Atlantic routes. The critical shift. The fight moves from national survival to systemic competition. The Dutch-led coalition isn't just evading Spanish power. It is profitably building a parallel commercial world that excludes Spain. Historical example 2. The Nazi New Order and Sterling Bloc, 1931 to 1945. 1931. Britain abandons the gold standard, creating a sterling area of colonies and trading partners who peg currencies to the pound. It's a defensive, exclusionary bloc. Axis response. Nazi Germany creates a bilateral clearing system with Southeast Europe and Latin America, trading machinery for raw materials outside the sterling/dollar system. The lesson. When dominant powers create closed monetary zones, rivals are forced to do the same. The global system fragments into competing blocs. Historical example 3. The Eurasian pivot, 2017 to 2022. 2017. Following Crimea sanctions, Russia and China sign a memorandum to integrate their SBFS and CIPS payment systems. 2018. The EU, frustrated by U.S. secondary sanctions on Iran, creates INSTEX, Instrument in Support of Trade Exchanges, a special-purpose vehicle to facilitate non-dollar, barter-like trade with Iran. A U.S. ally builds a workaround. The coalition expands. By 2021, over 24 nations, including India, Turkey, and members of the Eurasian Economic Union, are either testing or signing local currency trade agreements with Russia and China. The coalition is no longer just the sanctioned, it is the risk-averse. Stage 4. The institutionalization. Ad hoc systems become formal. Barter deals become currency swaps. Memorandum of understandings become binding treaties. The rival infrastructure hardens, gaining permanence and functionality. Historical example 1. The Dutch institutional triumph, 1609 to 1648. 1609. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, Wisselbank, is founded. It guarantees deposits and offers reliable currency exchange, becoming Europe's clearinghouse of choice. 1611. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange formalizes trading, including shares of the Dutch East India Company, VOC. The result? By the mid-1600s, the Dutch guilder, backed by this robust institutional framework, displaces the Spanish real as the most trusted currency in European trade. The weaponized system has been outbuilt. Historical example 2. The Soviet Comecon, 1949 to 1991. In response to the U.S. Marshall Plan and Cold War containment, the USSR establishes the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon. It creates the transferable ruble, an artificial clearing currency for trade within the Eastern Bloc, completely insulated from the dollar. The flaw, while ultimately inefficient due to a lack of market signals, it proved a closed financial system could operate at scale for decades, isolating member states from Western financial pressure. Historical example 3. The BRICS Plus Multilateral Framework, 2023 present. 2023, BRICS expands from 5 to 10 members, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, and Egypt, key energy producers. 2024, discussions formalize around a BRICS bridge currency for trade settlement, backed by a basket of member currencies and commodities. The infrastructure hardens. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, grows to over 142 direct participants worldwide. Russia's SBFS is used by over 550 entities across 20 countries. These are no longer prototypes, they are live networks. Stage 5. The erosion and flip. The dominant powers' tools lose potency. Transaction volumes slowly migrate to the new system. A critical mass is reached, and the economic order undergoes a paradigmatic flip. The sanction becomes an empty threat. Historical example 1. Spain bankruptcy and decline, 1620 to 1670. Despite controlling silver mines, Spain declared sovereign bankruptcy in 1607, 1627, 1647, and 1653. Dutch and English banks now finance Spain's enemies. Spanish silver, once a weapon, the flip flowed to Amsterdam to pay for Peace of Westphalia recognized Dutch independence. The Amsterdam-centered system was now the nexus of global capitalism. Spain's financial weapon had vaporized. Historical example 2. The end of sterling hegemony, 1944 to 1956. 1944. Bretton Woods formally dethrones the pound, making the dollar the sole gold-backed reserve currency. 1956. The Suez Crisis proves the final blow. The U.S., opposing the Anglo-French invasion, threatens to sell its sterling bonds and block an IMF rescue. Britain is forced into a humiliating retreat. The irony: Britain's own weapon, financial pressure, was used by its successor to enforce compliance. The system had flipped. Historical example 3. The dollar's inevitable erosion, the present trajectory. The data: the dollar's share of global central bank reserves has fallen from 73% in 2001 to 58% in 2024, a 15-point drop. Sanction evasion: Russia-China trade is now over 90% conducted in rubles and yuan. India pays for Russian oil in dirhams and rupees. Sanctions failed to cripple the Russian economy, which has been reconfigured. The new calculus: in February 2024, a Russian company executed the first-ever digital financial asset transaction with Chinese counterparties, completely bypassing Western banks. The template for Stage 5 is operational. The pattern is complete. Weaponization begets adaptation. Adaptation begets coalition. Coalition begets institutionalization. Institutionalization begets erosion. Every single time. Stage 4. Institutionalization. The United States dollar system is at Stage 4. Right now, the ad hoc workarounds have hardened. The memorandums have become treaties. The coalition of over 40 nations is no longer just discussing an alternative. They are building the architecture, brick by brick, transaction by transaction. This is not a future prediction. It is a present tense fact. Current evidence. The architecture is live. The BRICS expansion and bridge currency, 2023 to 2024. In January 2024, BRICS officially doubled its membership. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, and Egypt, four of the world's key hydrocarbon exporters, are now inside the bloc. Official working groups are now tasked with developing a BRICS bridge currency for intra-bloc trade, moving beyond mere local currency agreements to a formal, shared settlement unit. De-dollarization acceleration. Central banks. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen 15 percentage points since the year 2000. But the pace is accelerating. In Q4 2023, central banks bought 1,037 tons of gold, the highest annual purchase on record. They are swapping dollar IOUs for tangible assets outside the Western financial system. Bilateral currency blocks are formalizing. March 2024. China and Saudi Arabia finalize a permanent $7 billion currency swap line. India and the UAE now settle oil trades in rupees, using a newly built real-time payment link. These are not emergency measures. They are permanent financial corridors. The infrastructure metrics prove it. China's CIPS system processed approximately 123 trillion yuan, $17 trillion, in 2023. While still a fraction of SWIFT's volume, this represents year-over-year growth of over 25%. Russia's SBFS, though smaller, is now used by banks in Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Cuba. The network is physically extending. The catalyst, February 24, 2022. Every finance minister from Brasilia to Beijing watched and realized one thing. The weapon is total. The decision to freeze approximately $300 billion of Russian central bank assets and sanction Russia's major banks was the largest, most aggressive financial sanction in history. It achieved its short-term shock, but it triggered an irreversible long-term calculation. The revelation was simple. Foreign exchange reserves are not reserves if they can be taken. They are a liability. A sovereign nation's savings, held in U.S. treasuries and European banks, were not safe assets. They were political hostages. This was not an action against a pariah state like North Korea. This was against a G20 member, a permanent UN Security Council member. The precedent erased a 50-year foundation of global finance, the perceived neutrality and safety of the eurodollar system. Stage 4 indicators, the checklist. We can measure the institutionalization with hard metrics. This is where the pattern becomes undeniable. Indicator 1, central bank gold purchases. 2010, net purchases of 77 tons. 2022, net purchases of 1,136 tons. 2023, net purchases of 1,037 tons. What it means, nations are exiting dollar-denominated securities for a neutral, non-sanctionable asset. This is the foundation of a new reserve system. Indicator 2, bilateral local currency trade pacts. 2015, a handful of bilateral agreements exist, e.g., China-Russia. 2024, over 70 bilateral local currency trade agreements are in force, involving China, India, Russia, ASEAN nations, and Gulf states. The G20 is fracturing into a web of direct currency links. Indicator 3, usage of alternative financial messaging systems. 2014, SWIFT processes 90% of global cross-border transaction messages. CIPS/SBFS are nascent. 2024, CIPS has 142 direct participants in 112 countries. While SWIFT still dominates, the viable alternative now has global reach. The monopoly is broken. Indicator 4, dollar share in global trade invoices. 2001, 80% of global trade invoices are in USD. 2023, that share has fallen to 58% for goods flows outside North America. The euro and yuan are gaining, but the real story is the other category, direct currency pairs bypassing the dollar entirely. Indicator 5, U.S. Treasury holdings of sanction risk nations. 2014, Russia holds over $150 billion in U.S. treasuries. 2024. Russia's official holdings are reported as negligible. China's holdings have dropped from a peak of $1.32 trillion, 2013, to $816 billion, 2024, a 38% reduction. They told you the dollar was eternal. The truth is, its foundation is being dismantled by the very hand that sought to weaponize it. We are not approaching stage 4. We are living in it. The institutions are being built before our eyes. And you cannot put this genie back in the bottle. The sanction spiral is not a theory. It is a force of financial geology, reshaping the global economic landscape. There will be winners who position themselves on the new fault lines, and losers clinging to the crumbling bedrock of the old system. For the winners, commodity-rich and manufacturing-centric nations, countries with hard assets, Saudi Arabia, UAE with oil, Russia with commodities, China with manufacturing dominance, gain immense leverage. They can demand payment in their own currencies or in the new settlement units they design. Their real wealth becomes the anchor for new financial systems, just as Dutch trade anchored the guilder. Financial hubs of the new network, locations like Dubai, Singapore, and Shanghai are poised to become the new Amsterdams, the neutral-ish clearinghouses for multi-currency, non-dollar trade. They will build the legal and technical infrastructure for this new world, reaping fees and influence. Gold and strategic resource holders, nations with large gold reserves, Russia, China, India, and those controlling critical minerals, Chile with lithium, Congo with cobalt, hold the tangible cards. In a fragmented system, physical assets trump financial promises. The insulated domestic economies, nations with large internal markets, like India and Indonesia, can use this transition to deepen domestic financial systems and reduce external vulnerability. They can pivot between blocs, playing the new multipolar system to their advantage. Historical precedent: the Dutch merchants of the 1600s. They were not the largest empire, but they built the best infrastructure, the exchange bank, the stock exchange, and controlled key trade flows, the Baltic grain trade, the spice routes. They won not by having the most silver, but by having the most reliable system. For the losers, nations with weaponized currencies, the United States, and to a lesser extent the Eurozone, will face the erosion of the exorbitant privilege. The ability to fund deficits cheaply through endless global demand for treasuries will diminish. Borrowing costs will rise structurally. Financial institutions tied to the old order, major Wall Street and City of London banks that profit from dollar clearing and dominance, face a slow but steady margin compression. Their unique access is no longer unique. Countries with high dollar-denominated debt, emerging markets that borrowed heavily in dollars will be caught in a vice if dollar liquidity becomes scarcer and more expensive. They are vulnerable to the volatility of a retreating hegemon. The unaligned and exposed, nations without clear commodity wealth or strategic alliances, dependent on dollar-based supply chains and financing, risk being marginalized or forced into unfavorable terms by competing blocs. Historical precedent: the Spanish crown in the 17th century. It owned the silver mines, but lost control of the financial system. It became a debtor to the very networks it tried to destroy, bankrupt and strategically impotent. Projected timeline: based on the pattern. Historical timelines compress. Spain's spiral took 80 years. Britain's took 40. The digital age accelerates everything. 2025 to 2030. Institutional completion and bloc consolidation. The BRICS bridge currency or a similar settlement unit launches in pilot form. De-dollarization of major commodity trades, e.g., Saudi oil to China, crosses the 50% threshold. The U.S. responds with financial defensive measures, potentially including capital controls or aggressive use of remaining sanctions, accelerating the flight. Volatility becomes the norm in FX markets as the dollar's anchor role weakens. 2030 to 2035, the bifurcation crisis and loss of critical mass. Two parallel, overlapping global financial systems operate: a dollar-centric bloc and a multi-currency commodity-backed bloc. The dollar's share of global reserves falls below 50%, triggering a psychological and technical tipping point. A major geopolitical crisis or U.S. debt ceiling event occurs where sanctions are threatened but fail to compel compliance, demonstrating the weapon's impotence. This is the Suez moment for the dollar. 2035 to 2050, the new equilibrium, multipolar fragmentation. No single currency dominates as the dollar once did. Regional hegemonies and currency blocks are formalized. Digital currency platforms, CBDCs, become the primary conduits for cross-block settlement, embedding financial sovereignty and sanction-proofing into the code. Trade becomes more bilateral and regional, less globalized. Efficiency is sacrificed for resilience and political security. The bottom line. The pattern is clear. It is a cycle of hubris, reaction, and structural decline. The United States, by transforming the dollar system from a public good into a national security weapon, has triggered the same self-defeating spiral that has undone every financial hegemon before it. The question is no longer if the unipolar dollar system will end. It is when. The scaffolding for its replacement is already under construction by a coalition representing the majority of the world's population and resources. The timeline is not centuries. It is decades. And the countdown began not in 2022, but the moment the world's central banks watched $300 billion in Russian reserves vanish from the ledger. Trust, once broken, is not rebuilt. It is replaced. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. It presents historical analysis, opinions, and interpretations based on publicly available sources. It is not financial advice, political advice, or a prediction of future events. All historical comparisons and references to modern countries or governments are theoretical and should not be interpreted as claims, certainties, or endorsements. The global financial system is complex, and many factors influence its evolution. Viewers are encouraged to research independently and draw their own conclusions. March 2024. The data is plotted. The pattern is confirmed. From the Spanish embargo that built Amsterdam, to the British blockade that fueled autarky, to the dollar sanctions now forging a new financial network, the script never changes. Weaponization, adaptation, coalition, institutionalization, erosion. 40 nations are now architects. Gold is moving east. Currencies are linking directly. The institutional blueprints are signed. This is not speculation. This is the historical pattern playing out in real time. The sanction spiral is irreversible. The only thing left to write is the final chapter.